The heavy, mud-splattered boot of a guild enforcer slammed against the lower leg of Sarah Jenkins's wooden flour bin, sending a fine white cloud exploding into the freezing October air of Opal Creek. 19-year-old Sarah flinched, not from fear, but from the desperate need to protect the remaining rows of her sweet cinnamon knots, the only thing standing between her and a night spent sleeping in the frosted brush. The enforcer sneered his thick fingers, wrapping around the handle of her wicker basket. "The market tax just doubled for unregistered vagrants, girl," he barked. Sarah clenched her jaw, her round, dimpled face hardening as she threw her weight over her wares, refusing to let them steal the bread that carried her parents' freedom in every single grain. The silence that followed the dull thud of the enforcer's boot was heavy, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic whistling of the wind coming off the high Wyoming plains. An omniscient eye looking down upon the crowded market square of Opal Creek in the year 1884 would have seen a stark study in social division. To the west, where the dry goods store threw wide its heavy oak doors, the wealthy wives of cattle barons gathered in wool cloaks trimmed with velvet, their laughter carrying over the scent of fresh coffee and roasting meat. But down in the eastern hem, tucked precariously between the livery stable and the blacksmith's forge, the air was thick with the stench of wet manure, old leather, and desperation. This was the corner designated for the invisible, the place where the town council pushed those who had no names, no families, and no fortunes to protect them. Sarah stood in that frozen shadow, a 19-year-old girl whose world had been violently stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. Just 3 short months ago, Sarah's life had been a beautiful tapestry of warmth, laughter, and the rich, sweet scent of rising dough. She had been the treasured plus-size daughter of the most celebrated baking family in the prosperous city of Laramie. Her parents owned Jenkins & Sons Bakery, an institution famous across the territory for its century-old secret sourdough starter and immaculate pastries. Because of her soft, chubby stature and round, dimpled cheeks, she had been pampered by her father and doted on by her mother, spending her days learning the delicate chemistry of sugars and yeasts. But the omniscient memory of the territory recorded a darker truth: success in the West always invited wolves. Gideon Sterling, a corrupt and immensely powerful member of the Regional Commerce Board, had coveted the proprietary recipes and the prime downtown land where the Jenkins Bakery sat. When Sarah's father refused to sell his legacy for a pittance, Sterling orchestrated a devastating, flawless frame-up. He bribed a local supplier to poison a batch of public flour and planted barrels of rotted, vermin-infested ingredients deep within the bakery's storeroom. Within 48 hours, her parents were arrested under manufactured charges of malicious public endangerment, thrown into the stone cells of the territorial penitentiary. They faced a lifetime in prison unless Sarah could raise a massive bail fee and hire a high-priced Cheyenne attorney to uncover the truth. Fleeing the hostile town with nothing but her father's leather-bound recipe ledger, Sarah had come to Opal Creek under an assumed name, hiding her identity to earn the money, cent by cent, before the winter circuit court closed its doors. Now standing in the mud, she faced the local enforcer, a man whose greed was as plain as the brass badge pinned to his coat. "I paid my 50 cents at dawn," Sarah said, her voice remarkably level, though a dangerous fire smoldered in her chest. "The law doesn't double the tax for the hem." "The law is what I say it is, girl." The enforcer countered, his hand tightening on the wicker basket. "Pay another 50 or this whole crate goes to the town hogs." Sarah looked at the golden cinnamon knots, her knuckles turning white against her apron. She knew that if she gave up her profits today, she would not have enough to pay for her small freezing room above the tannery, let alone send a single dollar to the lawyer in Cheyenne. A deep, ancient exhaustion threatened to pull her down, but she forced her spine straight, drawing upon the strength her father had passed to her during long nights at the ovens. She made a silent, unyielding vow she would not let them break her. The enforcer raised his hand to rip the basket from her grasp, but the sudden, deliberate crunch of heavy gravel behind him made him freeze. The footsteps were unhurried, carrying the rhythmic, heavy weight of quality leather boots that belonged to a man accustomed to walking his own vast empire. The noisy crowd near the dry goods store fell naturally silent, a quiet ripple of caution and respect traveling through the morning market. Caleb Vance walked through the gray light, his long wool duster coat dark against the frosted grass, his wide-brimmed hat tilted just enough to shadow his sharp features. He was a man built of wire and muscle, a legendary reclusive millionaire cattle baron who owned half the valley and owed nothing to the town council. He did not look at the enforcer, nor did he look at the guild merchants, who suddenly found great interest in the dirt beneath their feet. He walked straight to the edge of Sarah's grease-stained wooden table and stopped. His eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, took in the entire scene with a single comprehensive glance. He saw the white flour on Sarah's red hands, the stubborn, protective tilt of her round jaw, and the subtle elegance of the pastries laid out on the rough pine boards. Caleb Vance traveled frequently to Laramie for his banking business, and as he looked at the specific twist of the cinnamon knots and the unique glaze on the sourdough loaves, an omniscient flash of recognition struck his mind. He knew that specific bake. He had eaten it at Jenkins & Sons Bakery 100 times. He looked at the girl's face, seeing the unmistakable features of the Jenkins line beneath the dust and sorrow. He recognized her disguise, her immense talent, and the desperate war she was fighting. Without a single word of explanation, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and drew out a heavy, polished silver $5 coin. He dropped it onto the center of the wooden table with a dull, authoritative thud that seemed to echo across the entire alley. "I'm buying the table," Caleb said, his voice low and raspy, carrying the gravel of the high plains. The enforcer swallowed hard, his hand dropping away from the basket. "Mr. Vance, she hasn't paid the extra—" "I said I'm buying the table," Caleb repeated, turning his head just enough to fix his iron gaze on the officer. "The bread, the crate, and everything she's offering. If there's change, keep it for your trouble." The enforcer quickly took the silver coin and retreated into the crowd like a dog called off a scent. Caleb turned his attention back to Sarah, lifting a cinnamon knot and taking a slow, appreciative bite. The rich scent of real butter and properly ground queef filled the cold air between them. "My last cook left in August," Caleb said, plain and square, leaning one elbow on the edge of the table. "Left me with 31 cowhands out at the ridge eating beans that taste like gravel. I need someone who knows how to handle a cast-iron stove and keep men from mutiny. The pay is $30 a month, a private room behind the kitchen, and all the flour you can work." It was a fortune, safety a roof, and an escape from the freezing town. But Sarah Jenkins did not lose her composure. She looked at the powerful millionaire, her jaw set, her mind already calculating how quickly $30 a month could build her parents' rescue fund. She knew that out on the isolated plains of Vance Ridge, she would be entering a world of hardened men, but she also saw the genuine protection in Caleb's eyes. "$30 is fair, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "But we set the terms before I load my cart. In that kitchen, what I say goes. The menu, the pantry, and the schedule are mine. Do we have an understanding?" Caleb Vance looked at the fierce, beautiful determination in the young woman's face and nodded once. "Agreed, Mrs. Jenkins. Pack your things. We leave for the ridge at noon." As he walked away, Sarah looked down at the silver coin, her mind already turning toward the massive cast-iron kingdom that awaited her, unaware that this new beginning would soon lead her to a final showdown for her family's freedom. The 6-mile wagon ride out to Vance Ridge was a brutal introduction to the vast, unyielding scale of the Wyoming prairie, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding relentlessly against a road that felt less like a path and more like a jagged scar across the earth. 19-year-old Sarah Jenkins held the leather reins of the rented mule cart with a practiced steady grip, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the amber grasslands met the heavy gray bellies of the autumn clouds. The dry whistling wind whipped across her round cheeks, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused entirely on the road ahead, her mind a quiet storm of calculations. In the wagon bed behind her, her entire life had been reduced to a carved wooden crate, a heavy sack of hard winter wheat, and her father's leather-bound recipe ledger tucked securely beneath her seat. She was moving toward a future defined entirely by 31 hungry men and a powerful stranger's word. But as the perimeter fences of the massive Vance Ridge estate finally came into view, Sarah felt no fear. Only the cold, sharpening focus of a woman who knew that her hands held the key to her parents' salvation. Caleb Vance was waiting at the hitching post, his long wool duster coat catching the dust kicked up by her arrival. He didn't step forward with the empty, practiced chivalry of a town merchant. Instead, he watched the deft, powerful manner in which the chubby girl handled the stubborn mule, acknowledging her competence with a silent, approving nod. Her physical build, thick-boned and sturdy from years of working alongside her father at the Laramie ovens, allowed her to control the animal with an ease that surprised most men. When the cart groaned to a halt, Caleb gestured toward a lanky, red-haired hand who had been mending a fence nearby. "Ames, haul these crates down to the cookhouse pantry," Caleb commanded, his deep baritone cutting through the constant hum of the prairie wind. "And mind the flour bins. They're heavy." He then turned his gray eyes toward Sarah, his weather-beaten face holding a brief, rare expression of respect. "Welcome to the Ridge, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, simply stepping back to let her cross the threshold of her new domain, honoring the boundary of independence she had drawn in the mud of the marketplace. Inside the cookhouse was a cathedral of absolute intimidating utility. At its center stood the massive 6-burner cast-iron range stove, its black metal body polished to a dull gleam, the firebox clean and ready. The deep pantry was lined with thick cedar shelves holding barrels of salt pork, sacks of dry pinto beans, and crates of winter potatoes. Standing in the center of the room, Sarah felt the lingering fatigue of her flight from Laramie lift from her shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of authority. This was a space where her rules mattered, where her labor could not be stolen by corrupt ordinances or anonymous complaints. She set to work immediately, her movements fluid and efficient, as she stoked the firebox, set a massive iron pot of beef stock to reduce on the back burner, and began kneading the heavy sourdough that would either earn her the respect of the ranch or seal her failure. The true test of her sovereignty came at noon, when the iron triangle clanged across the yard, summoning the 31 cowhands from the south pastures. They filed into the long dining hall attached to the kitchen, a turbulent wave of sweat-stained hats worn leather chaps, and the heavy, sharp scent of prairie dust and horses. These were hardened men who worked 12 hours a day in the saddle, their dispositions entirely dependent on the quality of the fuel provided to them. For 6 weeks they had endured Caleb's burnt biscuits and gray trail gruel, and a thick cloud of collective skepticism hung over the long timber tables. Sarah stood behind the serving counter, her apron tied tight around her waist, her round face an unreadable mask as she ladled the steaming, fragrant beef stew. Near the middle of the line came Luke, a young hand with an arrogant slant to his jaw and a reputation for testing anyone he deemed vulnerable. He took his tin plate, stared down at the thick gravy and the golden, perfectly risen cornbread, and dropped the plate onto the wooden table with a loud, deliberate clatter. "Looks like town food," Luke announced, his voice carrying easily over the low murmurs of the room. "Too soft for men doing real work on the range. A plump little town girl like this doesn't have the grit to feed a real crew. These biscuits look like they'd melt if a hard rain hit them." The room went dead silent, the other hands pausing with their forks halfway to their mouths. Sarah did not flinch, nor did she look toward Caleb, who sat watching silently from the far end of the table. Her omniscient understanding of the room, honed by years in her family's busy shop, had already given her all the leverage she required. She had noticed Hank Bradley, the iron-willed foreman, frowning at the weak coffee he had been served previously. She had also seen an older wrangler with a swollen, abscessed jaw quietly trying to avoid the tough chunks of salt pork. Without a word, Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, using her sturdy build to effortlessly carry a massive, roaring hot iron pot of coffee, black and thick as trail tar. She poured it directly into Hank Bradley's tin cup. Then she placed a separate small bowl of the longest simmered, tenderest beef broth directly in front of the hurting old wrangler. Before Sarah could even turn back toward the kitchen, Hank Bradley stood up, his massive, broad-shouldered frame casting a long shadow over Luke's bench. He took a slow, appreciative swallow of the hot coffee, slammed his cup down, and fixed his iron gaze on the arrogant young hand. "Luke," Hank said, his voice like the low rumble of a coming thunderstorm. "You got something to say about Mrs. Jenkins's cooking, you say it to her face, or you take your horse and your gear and you find a ranch that feeds you better. Otherwise, shut your mouth and eat." Luke's face flushed a deep crimson beneath his sunburn, and he slowly picked up his fork, dipping it into the stew. The first bite took the defiance right out of him, the rich, buttery flavor of her father's traditional recipe melting away his skepticism. Within minutes, the room returned to its natural rhythm, the satisfying sound of 31 men eating with absolute purpose. Sarah had not just fed them, she had drawn her line in the prairie dust and defended it without raising her voice. Later that evening, after the pots were scrubbed and the wood fire had settled into a steady, comforting crimson glow inside the belly of the iron range, the cookhouse became a sanctuary of stillness. Sarah sat at the long preparation table, her pencil moving across a clean ledger sheet as she compiled the ranch's winter supply list. Beside her lay her secret linen pouch where she carefully slid her first-earned dollar coins, the foundation of her parents' rescue fund. The boots on the porch steps were slow and deliberate. Caleb Vance stopped at the doorway, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, his sharp gray eyes tracking the neat rows of Sarah's handwriting before settling on her face. He didn't come inside, respecting her domain, but his presence brought a quiet weight to the room. "Hank says the men worked twice as fast this afternoon," Caleb said, his voice level and low. "Said a good dinner makes a hand forget the frost in his boots." "They work hard, Mr. Vance," Sarah replied without looking up from her ledger, though her dimpled cheek softened slightly. "They require grease in the wheels. I intend to provide it." "You've done more than that," Caleb said, his gaze drifting toward the ledger and the quiet intensity in her posture. "The ranch feels different tonight, solid." The silence that followed was comfortable, a shared space between a powerful man who protected his borders and a young woman determined to build her own leverage. Sarah felt the anchor of Vance Ridge sinking into her bones, providing a temporary shield against the ghosts of Laramie. Yet even as the warmth of the iron stove kept the autumn chill at bay, the omniscient narrator could see what Sarah could not. The mail rider was already crossing the county line, carrying a legal summons bearing the seal of the Regional Commerce Board and the distinctive predatory signature of Gideon Sterling, who had finally tracked his prey to the borders of the ridge. The first frost of November arrived overnight, turning the boundless grasslands of Vance Ridge into a brittle sea of silver glass. Inside the warmth of the timber cookhouse, the rich, comforting scent of rising sourdough and simmering chicory coffee offered a stark contrast to the bitter winter creeping across the territory. Sarah Jenkins stood at her smooth pine table, her palms moving in a rhythmic, unhurried cadence as she kneaded the morning's third batch of heavy dough. For 6 weeks, this sanctuary of flour and iron had been her peace. The 31 cowhands no longer grumbled. They entered her dining hall with their hats tipped respectfully, their boots wiped clean at the threshold, and their plates scraped bare out of genuine reverence for her work. Hank Bradley had even taken to splitting extra firewood for her stove, ensuring the young girl never had to lift a heavy log herself. But an omniscient observer looking through the steam-fogged windows would have seen that the quiet equilibrium Sarah was building coin by coin was about to be violently shattered. The heavy timber door of the cookhouse swung open, letting in a sharp blast of sub-zero air and the grim, uncharacteristic silence of Caleb Vance. He did not remove his hat. Instead, he stood near the threshold, his dark wool coat dusted with trail frost, his gray eyes holding a weight that Sarah recognized instantly. It was the look her father had carried in Laramie right before the world fell apart. Once the latch clicked shut, Caleb stepped closer to the table, reaching into his pocket. He drew out a crisp, heavy sheet of parchment bearing an official wax seal and laid it flat on the flour-dusted wood. "The mail rider brought this from the county seat," Caleb said, plain and square, his voice gravelly. "It's an emergency injunction from the Regional Commerce Board, a formal intent to shut down operations here citing a public health hazard. They claim 3 people in town fell deathly ill from the baked goods you sold at the harvest market." Sarah did not look down at the paper. Her gaze remained fixed on the white flour on her knuckles, but her heart turned to absolute flint. Through the omniscient lens of memory, the past rushed back in a terrifying, suffocating wave. Gideon Sterling's predatory face flashed before her eyes. The corrupt board member had used this exact same weapon to ruin her parents. First came the anonymous, unverified complaints about spoiled flour, followed by sudden inspections, fabricated testimonies from paid local merchants, and ultimately an illegal board seizure that stripped her family of their legacy and threw her parents into a stone cell. Now, Sterling's spies had tracked her to Opal Creek. He knew she was accumulating funds to hire a lawyer, and he was moving to crush her before she could reopen the Laramie case. "It's a lie, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, steady calm that belied her 19 years. "Nobody sickened from my kitchen. Gideon Sterling wrote that complaint himself, just as he wrote the ones that imprisoned my parents. He wants me broken, and driven out of the territory so no one can question how he steals his land." Before Caleb could answer, the sharp, authoritative clatter of iron-shod hooves echoed from the frozen yard. Looking through the glass, they saw a black buggy pull to a halt. A young county deputy clerk climbed down holding a brass-tipped rod of office, but it was the man sitting inside the carriage who held the true malice of the scene. Gideon Sterling sat wrapped in a black beaver fur coat, a polished silk hat atop his silver hair, a smug, predatory smile fixed on his aristocratic face. Han did not deign to step into the dirt, but his presence alone poisoned the morning air. The deputy clerk marched to the porch, shouting through the door, "Sarah Jenkins, you are formally commanded to cease all commercial production of food and appear before the board. This Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Failure to comply will result in immediate arrest and the seizure of this property's stores." Sarah moved toward the door, her hand gripping the iron latch ready to face her ruin. But Caleb's heavy, calloused hand caught her forearm. "Stay inside, Sarah," he commanded quietly. He stepped out onto the porch alone, his tall frame blocking the doorway completely. Sarah watched through the window as Caleb, the reclusive millionaire who held the financial reins of the valley, glared at the carriage. His voice boomed across the yard like a rifle shot. "You tell Sterling that if his boots touch a single blade of Vance ridgegrass, I'll treat him like any other thieving coyote. We'll be at the hearing on Friday. Now get off my land." The deputy clerk paled, scrambling back into the buggy, and the carriage hurried away into the gray fog. Caleb returned to the kitchen, his jaw set hard. Sarah was already reaching for her apron strings, tears of frustration finally pricking her eyes. "I will pack my cart tonight, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trembling. "Sterling will not stop until he destroys this ranch to get to me. I cannot let you lose your livelihood because of my ghosts." Caleb stepped into her path, his gray eyes flashing with a fierce protective anger. "You stood alone in Laramie, Sarah, because your father was failing and the town was bought. But you aren't standing alone in Opal Creek. This is Vance Ridge, and you are part of this ranch now. We don't run from thieves." He walked to the preparation table and pulled out a lantern. "I didn't wait for that snake to strike." Caleb revealed a grim satisfaction cutting through his anger. "Last week, when the town gossip first reached the pastures, I rode through the night to Cheyenne. I didn't hire just any lawyer, Sarah. I hired Margaret Hale. She's the sharpest, most expensive attorney in the territory, and she's been quietly gathering evidence against Sterling's fraudulent board transactions for 2 years. She's coming here tonight." True to his word, by nightfall, a small buggy arrived carrying Margaret Hale. The attorney was a compact, formidable woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that cut like a razor. Within an hour, the kitchen table was transformed from a baker's bench into a war room covered in legal deeds, county ledgers, and official board transcripts. Margaret pointed a slim finger at 3 different documents. "Look at the wording in this anonymous complaint against you, Sarah," the lawyer murmured, her voice filled with professional venom. "Now look at this one from Laramie and this one from a laundry owner in Sheridan. The phrasing is identical. A grave danger to the public hearth. Sterling has a specific pattern. He uses the board as a legal hammer to crush independent businesses before he buys up their property. With Mr. Vance's financial backing, we aren't just going to defend you on Friday. We are going to blow his entire operation wide open and bring your parents home." As they spoke, the heavy cookhouse door opened again. Hank Bradley walked in, accompanied by Ames and 3 of the older cowhands. The foreman pulled off his hat, his rugged face solemn under the lantern light. "We heard what happened out front this morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Hank said, looking from Sarah to the documents on the table. "The boys held a meeting in the bunkhouse. On Friday morning, all 31 of us are riding into town. We'll stand in that courtroom and swear on the holy book that your food is the cleanest, truest sustenance in the territory. If that board wants a fight, they're fighting the whole ridge." Sarah looked at the circle of weathered faces, at the fierce dedication in Caleb's eyes, and at the solid legal armor Margaret Hale was assembling. The terrifying shadow of Gideon Sterling had not vanished, but for the first time since her parents' arrest, the chubby girl did not feel like a helpless fugitive waiting for the blow to fall. She felt the deep, unbreakable foundation of a community rising around her, preparing for a final decisive battle in the courthouse of Opal Creek. The dawn of that decisive Friday broke over Opal Creek, not with the gentle gold of autumn, but with a harsh slate-gray light that matched the iron resolve of Vance Ridge. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the small wooden town square was already vibrating with an uncharacteristic heavy energy. An omniscient view of the territory would have revealed a striking sight. 31 hardened cowhands, led by the towering figure of Hank Bradley, riding 2 by 2 down the main street, their spurs clinking rhythmically against the frozen mud like a steady drumbeat of war. At the center of this protective iron cavalry rolled Caleb Vance's finest black carriage, inside of which sat Sarah Jenkins and Margaret Hale, their laps covered in heavy woolen blankets and the dense leather folders containing a family's stolen legacy. Sarah looked out the glass window. Her round jaw set her dimpled cheeks pale, but completely motionless. She was no longer the frightened girl fleeing Laramie in the middle of the night. She was a craftsman about to reclaim her fire. The county courthouse was a cramped, drafty room, smelling of old cedar and wet wool, packed to the walls with curious townspeople and defensive local merchants. At the front table sat Gideon Sterling, his black beaver fur coat draped elegantly over his chair, his fingers casually tapping a gold pocket watch. He didn't look back when the door groaned open, but the sudden suffocating silence that swept through the gallery forced him to turn. Sarah walked in first, her sturdy build held tall, her eyes locking onto the man who had imprisoned her parents. Behind her came Caleb Vance, his shadow broad and intimidating, followed by Margaret Hale, who carried her legal brief like a drawn sword. The three board members at the elevated bench shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from Caleb's icy gaze to the row of 31 armed cowhands who quietly lined the back wall, their hats held respectfully over their chests, but their eyes fixed on the scales of justice. This emergency hearing of the Regional Commerce Board is now in session. The head board member announced, his voice thin and trembling slightly under the collective weight of the room. The petition brought forward by the citizens of Opal Creek demands the immediate and permanent closure of the unregistered kitchen operating at Vance Ridge, citing 3 verified instances of severe public poisoning from contaminated wheat. Gideon Sterling stood up gracefully, smoothing his silk vest. "The law is clear, gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "The territory cannot tolerate rogue vagrants poisoning our industrious townsfolk with tainted goods. This girl's family has a documented history of criminal negligence in Laramie. The public safety requires her immediate removal from the county." "The only criminal history in this room belongs to you, Mr. Sterling." Margaret Hale's voice rang out, cutting through the smooth rhetoric like a clean blade. She stepped forward, slamming 3 heavy leather-bound ledgers onto the center table with an authoritative crash. "Administrative board laws require verified medical affidavits from a licensed territorial physician before an emergency closure can be ordered. I hold here the official logs of Dr. Thomas Byrne, the sole medical authority in this district. Not only does he state that no such poisoning occurred, but we have signed confessions from the 3 local merchants who were paid exactly $20 each by Mr. Sterling's personal clerk to feign illness after the harvest market." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Sterling's aristocratic face tightened, a sharp vein appearing on his temple. This is a preposterous fabrication, a desperate distraction from an unregistered baker. "We are just beginning, Mr. Sterling," Margaret continued, her voice rising with unyielding power. She drew a fresh sheaf of papers from her satchel, bearing the official blue ink seal of the Territorial Supreme Court in Cheyenne. "With the financial backing of Caleb Vance, we spent the last 48 hours examining the land deeds of downtown Laramie. We have uncovered the fraudulent bank routing numbers used to poison Jenkins & Sons Bakery 3 months ago. The supplier who planted the vermin in Mr. Jenkins's store was paid directly from a shell company registered under your name, designed specifically to force the foreclosure of the prime commercial lot where that bakery sits." The head board member banged his wooden gavel frantically, but the noise was completely swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Hank Bradley let out a low, victorious whistle from the back wall, and the 31 hands shifted closer to the front rail, their physical presence rendering the corrupt board entirely powerless. Sterling looked around the room, his eyes wild as he realized the wolves had finally been trapped by the shepherd. The evidence was absolute, documented, and backed by the immense financial and physical might of the wealthiest cattle baron in the valley. Before the board could even call for order, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, letting in a flood of crisp winter light. 2 federal marshals from Cheyenne walked down the center aisle, their silver badges gleaming against their coats. They bypassed the bench entirely, stopping directly behind Gideon Sterling. "Gideon Sterling, you are under federal arrest for wire fraud manufacturing, false public endangerment charges, and the illegal conspiracy to seize territorial property." The lead marshal declared, his iron handcuffs clicking open with a sound that felt like the final chord of a long, dark symphony. As Sterling was led out of the courtroom in disgrace, his silk hat falling into the mud of the aisle, the room erupted into a deafening cheer. Sarah Jenkins finally let out the breath she had been holding for 3 long months. The tears she had refused to shed during her long nights of exile finally rolled down her dimpled cheeks, but they were tears of absolute triumph. She looked to her left where Caleb Vance stood watching her with a rare bright smile warming his rugged features. He nodded once, a gesture that signaled the successful completion of a shared contract. 1 month later, the cold December wind still blew hard across the high plains, but the air inside Jenkins & Sons Bakery in Laramie was thick with the incomparable sweet warmth of rising sugar and fresh sourdough. The glass windows were spotless, reflecting the bright holiday lanterns of a town that had welcomed its favorite artisans back with open arms and deep apologies. Sarah stood at the large oak preparation table, her hands covered in white flour, working alongside her father, whose face was thin from his time in the cells, but radiant with newfound life. Her mother sat nearby humming a soft tune as she wrapped fresh cinnamon knots in clean brown paper for a line of customers that stretched out into the street. The bell above the shop door chimed, letting in a swirl of snow, and a tall, familiar figure wrapped in a dark wool duster coat. Caleb Vance stepped inside, removing his wide-brimmed hat as he walked up to the counter. He looked at the bustling, prosperous shop, then fixed his sharp gray eyes on Sarah, his expression filled with a quiet, everlasting pride. "The ridge is quiet, Sarah," Caleb said, plain and square, leaning against the counter. "The new cook tries hard, but the boys still grumble that the biscuits taste like trail gravel. They miss the boss of the kitchen." Sarah laughed, a rich, bubbly sound that filled the entire bakery. She picked up a massive, heavy wicker basket packed to the brim with golden glazed loaves and her signature cinnamon knots, handing it across the counter to the millionaire who had given her a sanctuary when she had nothing. "They won't have to miss it for long, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, her voice steady, confident, and full of the future. "Laramie is my family's home, but Vance Ridge is where I found my own strength. I've already spoken to my father. We are opening a second branch in Opal Creek this spring, and I'll be running the ovens myself. I'll see you at the Ridge by noon." Caleb took the basket, his hand brushing against hers with a silent promise of enduring protection and friendship. As he walked out into the winter sun, Sarah turned back to her ovens, her heart completely whole, knowing that the flour on her hands was no longer the dust of a fugitive, but the proud mark of a woman who had fought for her legacy and won.